Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us. My name is Sierra Sanchez, and I'll be behind the scenes helping to produce this webinar. Connect with us on social media. On Facebook, like the page Campaign for GLR. On Twitter, follow the account at Reading by Third. And on LinkedIn, follow us at Campaign for GLR. Please use hashtag Learning Tuesdays and tag us to tweet anything you learn from today's webinar, and we'll be sure to retweet. We encourage you to share your questions, reflections, and observations on social media. And before we get started, I just wanted to take a moment to acknowledge our enterprise and programmatic funders, as well as our individual donors. Your support not only allows us to hold these vital conversations, but also helps us create meaningful opportunities to share insights, foster connections, and build the CGLR community. Thank you. And as we get started, I wanted to share just a few housekeeping details with you. First, we'd love for you to introduce yourself, so please use the chat box at the bottom of the screen to share your name, city or state, and your organization. Be sure when responding to select everyone so that we all know who is here, and feel free to share your thoughts and insights throughout the duration of the webinar. All attendees are in listen-only mode, but we encourage your engagement by posting questions in the Q&A box. We will dedicate the last portion of the webinar to respond to those questions you post, and our panelists will be typing out answers throughout the discussion. The webinar is being recorded and live streamed on Facebook. A link to the recording, as well as any slides, bios, and resources, will be sent in a follow-up email to all who registered. And lastly, we'll be posting a brief on-screen poll during Q&A and highly encourage you to respond. This helps us with our commitment to continuous improvement. And before we get started, I wanted to turn your attention to some of our upcoming webinars. Next week on March 18th, we'll have an exciting funder-to-funder conversation at 12:30 Eastern Time, where we will be hearing from the Early Learning Nation Collective to discuss the power of communities in supporting children. That same day at 3 p.m., we'll be continuing our Decoding NAEP series, this time hearing directly from the perspectives of state chiefs, where we'll have a number of state chiefs sharing their perspectives and their thoughts. If you've missed any of our earlier Decoding NAEP series as well, we encourage you to look on our website and see the previous webinars that we've had. And on the 25th, we will be jumping back into our Crucible of Practice Salon. This conversation focused on Georgia stepping up to support summer learning. That'll be at 12:30 Eastern Time. And at 3 p.m. that same day, we were having More Hopeful Futures or Children as Collateral Damage, which will be a partner webinar. So more information and registration links for those sessions will be posted in the chat box now, and we hope that you can join us. And joining you now is Sarah Torian, Chief Learning and Engagement Officer with the Campaign for Grade Level Reading. Thank you and enjoy.
Thanks so much, Sierra, and welcome everyone. We're delighted that you could all join us for today's GLR Learning Tuesdays session, the 5th in our Decoding NAEP series, co-hosted
Sarah,
by...
I'm sorry to interrupt you. I think you're off camera, and we want to see your face. There we go. Thank you.
Sorry about that. Thank you, Sierra, and welcome everyone. We're delighted that you could all join us for today's GLR Learning Tuesdays session, the 5th in our Decoding NAEP series, with this session co-hosted in partnership with National Parent Union. We began this series back in early February with a broad overview of the 2024 NAEP data released in late January, and have been steadily digging our way deeper into that data to identify insights and actionable strategies of reporting children's learning and academic recovery. Our first session began with an examination of the overall headlines, hearing from reporters and researchers as they shared some of the major headlines and the stories underneath those headlines. Then we took a deeper look at who is scoring below NAEP Basic and what that means for those children, exploring opportunities and strategies for changing the trajectory around these concerning trends. In the third session, we looked at the Education Recovery Scorecard Report, which merged NAEP data with other state and local data sources to understand the impact chronic absenteeism is having on the pace of student learning and recovery, including some of the strategies that individual states are taking to boost attendance and learning. In the fourth session, we heard from leaders from Catholic, charter, Department of Defense, rural and urban communities, hearing what they are learning, or what we can learn from what they are doing and the progress that they are seeing that from those particular contexts. Today, we're partnering, as I said, with National Parents Union to bring together parent advocates and parent leaders from family-focused organizations to explore how NAEP scores are communicated, the common misconceptions families may have, and how we can bridge the gap between assessment results and actionable steps for parents, caregivers, and communities. I have the pleasure of introducing our panel for today. If we could bring those slides up. First, we have Ashara Baker, who is the New York State Director of the National Parents Union and co-founder of the New York State Charter Parent Council. Charlie Barone is the Senior Director for the Center for Innovation at National Parents Union and has been a central player in most major federal education reforms over the past 25 years. John Johnson is a parent leader with the Leadership Council on Assessment and Accountability and a strong advocate for his local school and its students, as well as deep engagement in youth sports in his community. Welcome also to Pascal Small, who is the Deputy Director of Impact and Engagement at National Parents Union. Her work focuses on expanding opportunities for communities by cultivating partnerships. Tiara Thomas is an American Indian educator, activist, and leader who advocates for the rights and recognition of the Piscataway Conoy tribe and other indigenous nations, as well as serving as a parent leader with the Leadership Council on Assessment and Accountability from Maryland. I'm also happy to welcome and introduce our moderator for today, Carrie Rodriguez, the co-founder and founding president of National Parents Union and a friend of the Campaign for Grade Level Reading, who I've heard introduce herself many times as the mom of Matthew, Miles, and David. I'll pass it over to you now, Carrie, to walk us through this conversation.
Well, Sarah, thank you so much. And Matthew, Miles, and David just got home, so you may hear some rumbling behind me, but what are you going to do? I am the proud mom of those three plus two bonus boys, and you know, it's about that time of day. But I am so excited for this conversation and to introduce you to so many of our extraordinary parent leaders, not only to hear their perspective, but also to introduce the idea that parents actually take this information very seriously. It's critically important to us. And as the united voice of modern American families, the National Parents Union is doing our best to do our own analysis around what parents need to know and to better understand how parents understand this information and how they want the information to change so that it's more actionable for all of us. So to help give us that perspective, I'm going to welcome one of the smartest guys I know, Dr. Charlie Barone, who is our Senior Director of the MPU Center for Innovation, who's going to start us off by providing an overview of the most recent NAEP results and discuss some of the trends that we in the parent community have been looking at very closely around student achievement. So Charlie, take it away.
Thanks, Carrie. Good to be here today on this important topic. We have some slides that we're going to pop up here. I did want to say, I'm just going to go briefly over some of the top lines from NAEP. We were told that, and as Sarah just summarized, you all have been through the data through these Tuesday learning sessions over the week. So I just want to reiterate a couple points that are key for this discussion and then just keep it moving to our other panelists. So we can pull up the first slide. The overall trend on NAEP this year was not good. On fourth grade reading, we definitely saw overall declines and reading proficiency in eighth grade is at its lowest level in 32 years, with only 67% of eighth graders and 60% of fourth graders achieving at least a basic reading level. The chart here illustrates one of the key trends from this NAEP. On the horizontal axis are years. So the last number on that axis is 22. That was this NAEP results. 24. This NAEP results, and then the last one's in 2019. And what's key here is this chart is broken out by achievement level for NAEP takers. So the top line are the more advanced NAEP takers. And then the bottom line are those below basic. And what you see a trend here is basically the top achievers haven't lost anything in recent years. If you go to these last 2 points on the chart, you see it's a pretty much a straight line for the advanced and the proficient takers. When you get down to basic and particularly below basic, we're actually seeing declines still, even this far out of the pandemic, in reading proficiency, which is particularly concerning. So the message here is our highest achievers are treading water, but our lowest achievers are still losing ground. And the other point I would make here is it's hard to tell from the horizontal axis here because the numbers are tiny, but this downward trend for the lower achievers actually started pre-pandemic. So the pandemic, it definitely accelerated the decline in reading proficiency, but that trend was present before the pandemic. So something's been going on that has led to lower achievement for our lowest performing students. The lowest are getting lower, and the ones in the higher realms are pretty much staying even, which is not fantastic news, but better than the news for those who are lowest achieving. Okay, next slide. So this is just some highlights from the data. When you look at just statically proficiency and scale scores, some of the OG states that have always been the top achievers are still the OG state top achievers. States like Massachusetts, New Jersey, and Virginia. When you look at some of the lowest performers, these are chronically low performing states: New Mexico, Alabama, Louisiana, just to name 3 examples. However, the top performing states are pretty stagnant, if not losing ground, whereas some of the lowest performers have actually made the most progress. So next slide. Biggest gainers in reading were Louisiana and Mississippi. We also saw good trends in Tennessee and in Alabama. These improvements are attributed to the adoption of evidence-based reading instruction methods, such as phonics and phonemic awareness. Some of the biggest losers are the states that have been traditionally high-performing: Massachusetts and New Jersey. They've experienced declines in reading proficiency. Those are not states that have undertaken comprehensive reading reforms either. In terms of the parent discussion today, I think we all have in our minds, what should parents be keying in on about these results? What do the results tell them about their states, and what they should be pushing for in their states? There's a whole lot going on in the middle here that isn't accounted for by the extremes, which was brought up in some of our early discussions prior to doing this panel, and they're important to pay attention to too. The gaining states, the 4 or 5 that are showing positive trends, are the outliers right now. So we need to look at what they're doing and try to get the other states, if not to do something similar, at least to try something that makes sense for their states with a similar level of intensity, or we don't know, right? The trends have been downward again since pre-pandemic. It's going to take a lot to reverse that, it seems. Okay, one more slide, I think. So again, there's a lot of states here, all 50 states, but what it's showing here is, if you go all the way to the right, you see the states that gained on 4th grade reading. The 2 states that gained were Louisiana and Alabama. They're both states that have undertaken very comprehensive reading reforms in recent years, particularly Louisiana. I was at a conference in October where some of the folks that have worked on the Louisiana reforms were attending. They predicted back in October that we would see a big bump in Louisiana on the NAEP, and I was impressed that they turned out to be right when the results were released in January. And then there's a whole lot of middle. I won't go through every state here. We can share these charts with you. Some states have really dropped off a lot, and that is concerning, but there is work to do in most states, judging by these trends. And so At the state level, at least at the broadest level, and we're not going to go through the data here, but there's also NAEP data for 15 or 20 urban districts that you can also look at. At least the state data tells us that more needs to be done at the state level. And then that has to be accompanied by parents looking at data from their districts and their schools to get the full picture. So I'm going to turn it back to you, Carrie. Those are just some of the top lines that can help frame where we go with this discussion.
Charlie, thank you so much. So helpful. I have a couple of questions for you. When you take a look at this information that comes out, I think it can be very overwhelming for a parent to look at this and understand, frankly, should I be worried? How worried should I be? There's so much information that comes at us about our kids. We get the information from, everyday tests, then we get report cards, then we get statewide assessments, then we get NAEP. Can you kind of talk through for parents and why it's important for us to pay attention to this particular measure?
NAEP is the only measure that gives us apple-to-apple comparisons between states. So when you look at a state like Mississippi or Louisiana or Alabama, states that have traditionally been in the basement on student achievement and that they're the biggest gainers, that tells you that change is possible and that these states are doing something that other states could do. So you want to look and see where your state is and then work with your parent advocacy groups to figure out what the advocacy agenda should be. Parents best know their kids' school and their kids' district, but they can look to NAEP to see how their state's doing compared to other states. And you can, make the argument that if Mississippi can do this, if Alabama can do this, if Louisiana can do this, then other states could do this and they're not doing it. And I think, what's particularly interesting is these gains are being made in states that have typically been at the bottom and been stagnant. So stagnantly low achieving almost as far back as you can remember. So I think that is like a barometer for state performance that's not going to be given to you by any other measure. Your state test data for your school and for your kid is different kind of data that can tell you other kinds of things. And, all these things do need to be looked at. And, one thing we try to do here at NPU is figure out how we help parents understand the data and point them where to look and then see what they think in terms of what they feel is lacking at their kids' school and what needs to be done.
Now, we know at the National Parents Union, data is critically important for us in what you just said, making sure that we are making this data actionable to hold systems accountable if we're in that messy middle that you talked about, or, if we're at the bottom of the stack. What other states can we look to see, how we can make progress and get out of the hole? And I think we've seen some of that in the states that you talked about, like Mississippi, where everyone's talking about the Mississippi miracle and saying, well, what did they do there and how can we replicate it? And we're seeing the benefit of that. I want to ask you, from the perspective of a parent who is right here in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, #1 in the nation for education. And boy, was my governor excited to tell everybody about the NAEP scores and how we were #1 and king of the hill here. But I don't know, when you take a closer look at those numbers, it didn't seem like there was a lot to be celebrating there. Are there some lessons and important things for those of us who may be in the top part of what we're seeing on these charts in terms of what we also need to look for and hold folks accountable to?
It's complicated because there's a lot to unpack. I mean, one advantage that some of the higher achieving states have, Massachusetts, New Jersey, other blue states, is they spend a lot on education, right? They're some of the highest spenders. They're some of the highest tax states, but are some of the biggest spenders. So they have a lot of resources going into the system. They tend not to have the extremes of poverty either. So it's telling you that the resources they spend are probably doing something, even if they're not being spent as efficiently as they could be. And that also probably parent education level and parent income has something to do. but they're not showing the gains. So they're not doing something that other states are doing. There's a question in the chat about Mississippi not doing quite as well this round as they had in the past, and whether the Mississippi is a fleeting and flawed strategy. I don't think so. They're pretty high achieving compared to other states, and particularly the one thing you should look at, and I didn't want to overwhelm people with data here, but the Urban Institute has adjusted NAEP scores for state demographics, and when you do that, Mississippi's in the top 10. You know, when you control for their demographics and look at their NAEP scores, they're in the top 10. They're pretty much in the top 10 even if you don't do that. So I live in New Jersey. My kids are I have twins. They're in middle school. It's a really good school. But I am concerned in my state, we are resting on our laurels. And I think that's a conclusion you can draw about Massachusetts and other states too. And we're not pushing hard enough for change. My kids are good. They're in a good school system. There's lots of kids, those kids you saw on the bottom line of the last chart who are dipping, that we're not helping, that need to be helped. So if you care about equity, you want to pay attention particularly to those lines of not just the average achieving student, but those who are already at the bottom and where they're losing ground.
One of the other questions that we got for you, Charlie, is whether or not NAEP's measurement takes into account immigration. Anita is wondering and noticing that in Maine, the numbers are way down, but the state has had an influx of non-English speaking immigration,
I don't
as
know.
we've seen in other states as well.
I don't know the answer to that question. We can check for you and get back to you.
All right. And a final question. If you had to put one thing as a priority, what should parents be focusing on most when looking at this data? Dina is an organizer and she wants to know what to focus on the most and what support she can give to the parents that she organizes.
Complicated. So I wanted to go back to Maine for a second. They definitely don't control for English language status. But whether they do something behind the scenes to try to sort it out is something I could check on. One resource you could go to is there's a group called Excel in Ed. They are, a center right group, but they are very evidence grounded, and they have been an organization that has provided technical support to a lot of the states that have improved their results, including Mississippi, including Louisiana. They have a chart where they go through state by state, and they have a series of maybe 20 things on literacy that they feel like every state should do. And then they check a box for each one each state has. So you can look at their state by state chart and see how many boxes are checked. That's not the whole story though. So I was looking at that a little while ago, and like Louisiana, Mississippi, they're checking every box. So's Delaware though, and Delaware was one of the biggest losers on NAEP. So there are other things that states need to be doing. Your state may have good policies on paper, but they may not be following through to make sure that change is driven down to the local level. It's easier in some states to control what's happening at the local level than it is in others. So Carrie Wright, who was the state superintendent in Mississippi overseeing much of their reforms, has now moved to Maryland. And I saw her speak last year about the differences she has in Maryland as opposed to Mississippi. In Mississippi, she was able to just hire all her reading coaches and screen them through her own office. They don't have that kind of control in Maryland, so she's trying to set some rubrics for doing that. So part of this, and it's hard, it's not easy for an average parent to do that. That's why I think advocates and experts need to work hand in hand with parent, is understanding how much control do your state have? In your particular state, how is education set up such that what power does the governor have? What power does the state superintendent have? How much independence do school districts have from the state? And then figuring out, based on that alignment of power and responsibility, where are the best places to be strategic about pushing for change?
Wonderful. And Sarah is also putting some additional resources in the chat. So if you're looking for more information, including the link to Excel and Ed and the information that Charlie was referencing, you can find it there. So Charlie, thank you so much for giving us a foundation and a baseline to start the conversation. Well, now it is my pleasure to have us be joined by some of my favorite people. We're going to start off with Pascal Small from the National Parents Union, who I'm going to invite to join us. First and foremost, as we introduce the NPU Leaders Council on Assessment and Accountability. This has been a special project that we have worked on with NPU, and the leaders that we have invited to join are part of our affiliate network. And the National Parents Union is actually a large organization of all these beautiful pockets of parent power in all 50 states, DC and Puerto Rico, about 1,800 of them, reaching about 1.8 million members across the country. And through that network, we have identified leaders who were really passionate and excited to talk about assessment, accountability. How do we use it? How do we change it so that it's more helpful? How do we make it actionable? How do we understand it better as parents and families? So Pascal, I want to invite you on first as we invite the entire panel, but first to just start us off by framing the project that we're about to talk about.
Hola todos, and I see some of our parents and our affiliates in the chat, and they're going crazy. Hi, everybody. I'm so excited to be here. So our Leaders Council on Assessment and Accountability is parents doing everyday work on making sure that our states are giving us the data that is so valuable and important to push forward smart, human-centered policy to make sure that our children can get the resources and supports they need, to make sure that our teachers also get the training and the curriculum that they need, so that our policies hold systems accountable, and so that we could just get better and better, because getting worse and worse is not working clearly. And so our parents came and they dreamed big with us, and that's what we asked them to do. We said, don't worry about what the systems do today. Don't think about the structures that we're placing you in. We want you to dream boldly and courageously on what assessments and accountability can be. And so that's exactly what our parents did with us. And I can't wait for them to come in the conversation.
Well, let's welcome them to this conversation. And these are parents who are passionate, who are excited, and are well-informed and excited to talk about NAEP and their perspectives and what information they've received from the National Report Card, but also what they need in the future from assessment and accountability. So Tiara, John, Ashara, if you can join us and come on screen. Wonderful. So I'm going to give everybody just a minute to introduce yourselves. Let's talk with first with Tiara Thomas, who is joining us from Maryland. Tiara, so nice to see you, honey.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me here with you guys. I'm excited to be a part of this conversation. I, like you, have a little that is coming home, so you may hear my dog going off in a minute. But I'm really excited to talk about NAEP and how our parents can use this data as we look to try to improve education for our students. Thank you.
Ashara, please join us.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Ashara Baker. I'm the New York State Director at the National Parents Union. I am extremely excited not only to represent NPU, but to really represent the work that's taking place across New York. New York families are on the ground. We are holding stakeholders and policymakers accountable in this space, and we are utilizing the data the way that we should be using it. So I'm excited to join in this conversation. Thank you.
And John, welcome to the conversation, joining us from Colorado.
Hello, all. My name is John Johnson, representing NPU for Colorado. My passion in this work is deep-rooted beyond my family, just kids abroad. And to be honest, kids of color, kids that are kind of left behind is kind of what drives my passion. I want to see the bottom become the top in the very near future.
So wonderful to have you, John. Well, Ashara, we're going to start with you. I think a lot of the perception that folks have is that, this NAEP data gets released and parents really don't know what they're looking at. They don't know what to do with it. We just kind of shrug our shoulders and keep it moving, but not in New York State. You are, as you said, the state director of NPU in New York. Can you tell us a little bit about what you're seeing in New York regarding the latest assessment results?
So, I mean, Charlie was spot on. We definitely have work to do, especially in New York. We are facing dramatic student outcomes. And when a lot of folks, especially New Yorkers, we are prideful people, when we talk about New York, we're top dog. But when you look at NAEP results, when you start to look at that state assessment data, we kind of do like the Bart Simpson, Homer Simpson fade into the bushes. That is how I would describe it. So for instance, within NAEP that was released, we had 31% of New York fourth graders and eighth graders who were tested proficient in reading. That is less than 50%. And it goes the same within math. We had 37% of fourth graders, 29% of eighth graders who were proficient in math. These aren't numbers that we're proud of. We have to do better. And now we are in a space where we are trying to have conversations and urge policymakers to put us in a better place. So with that being said, I first started out just having conversations with families across the state. And the biggest thing that stuck out was families really didn't know how students were performing. And we all know that there's power in information. So to have conversations with so many powerful advocates and they didn't have access to that information, I felt like we weren't doing them any justice. So with that being said, we wanted to create a way where parents could see how their kids were doing, how their districts were being funded, what interventions were in place in school, and then opportunities outside of school. So we developed what I call, it's like my baby. This is the second installment of it. It is the critical condition, the state of education in New York. And it is essentially the guide. And, I wouldn't call it a white paper. It's a report. It's spreading the gospel and putting power in parents' hands. So we have been traveling every year. We release it at the beginning of the school year. And it goes through a couple of things. One, biggest principle for us was around access and transparency. Because in New York, if you were to ask an advocate how they access data, they would say, well, I go to the New York State Education Department's website and I go to the data portal and I fill through information, and I would encourage parents to do the same. But we all know in the back of our minds, it's extremely challenging and it's just not fun. It's not fun to have to go through all those subcategories. So for us, we wanted to have it not only accessible, but transparent data. The second piece was around student outcomes, school performance data. Tell it how it is. Whether it hurts or not, we have to know how poorly these schools are performing. And then the third piece is we can't show up in places constantly addressing problems without addressing solutions. So we are always solution-oriented, action-oriented, and that is a part of our report. We highlight bright spots that take place across New York State. We also talk about actionable policy that policymakers can take on during legislative session, which we have actively done during last session and this session.
So 2 quick follow-up items for you. Number 1, the chat is lighting up right now with some parents saying, yes, state data can be a nightmare. Going to that website and trying to figure out where to go and am I in the right spot and am I pulling the right subgroup? All of this can be very difficult. And frankly, I don't know if that's intentional or not, but what you do see is that the folks that are policymakers, who are administrators or who are leading a lot of these districts, or even analysts, some of them are only taking a look at pieces of this data. Some of them might be cooking the books a little bit. Maybe their jobs rely on how good this data looks. So how important is it that we get our own direct data, that we look at something like the NPU report card, or we look at that NAEP data to make sure that we're getting an honest assessment about where things are from your perspective?
For sure. So 2 parts. One, this is an actual thing that happened to me. I was attending a caucus weekend and, mingling, we had a conversation with a representative of the commissioner's office. and I mentioned the report, and they looked at me and they said, "Why is this report important for families?" And I said, "Well, because when I introduce myself and I say that I'm from Rochester, New York, you look at me and you automatically know what that means. You know that there's 15% of third graders who are proficient in reading. There are 4% of eighth graders who are proficient in reading. I give this report to a parent in Rochester. They don't know what that means. They don't know how bad their schools are doing. So it's important for this data to be shared out because I believe that families have been receiving, I wouldn't even call it data. I would, like what the conversations we've had is the messaging behind information that families receive. So for instance, back to school nights, orientation, it's really housekeeping information. It's not data that they would use. And
It's
then
how do you
other,
pick your kid up at the loop?
yeah, yeah.
How are you going to make sure that their lunch card is filled with lunch money as opposed to like, here's actually where we are with data. It's frustrating.
Literally, I've nothing but drawers full of notes and reminders from Aubrey School about the library, about Scholastic book fairs, gym, nothing about how she's doing. So yes, I think that they're missing the mark with sharing out the appropriate data and information with families.
So, what has been the reaction to your report and parents being empowered by data and having this information and, frankly, using it to educate other parents who clearly love the fact that we're presenting a lot of this information? It empowers them. It gives them what they need to ask those deep questions. But how has this been received from, I don't know, other elected officials, the governor, the media? What's it been like?
I, so when we have to, hopefully we have the report in the chat. We always have
Yeah.
to do a disclaimer. When I go in places, one, I always got my Nikes on. I'm not running from anybody, but I'm ready to move because sometimes people kind of get in their feelings about the information. And I always say the report is not laid out to be a finger pointing report. We are essentially, we're just telling it how it is. We have to be honest in order to move forward and make changes for our kids. So first and foremost, parents, parents who are in districts like Rochester or Albany, Syracuse, who are coming from singular digit performance rates, they're confused. They're like, I didn't know this, or we've never heard any of this, and why is my kid in ninth grade when like looking at seventh and eighth grade math results, how are they even approaching this portion of algebra when they don't have the foundational skills? So one, parents are in a place where they're just like, it's an aha moment. It's like, what do we do? I believe for educators sometimes co-conspirators are like, I know, and there's nothing we can do. We've been advocating, we've been trying to change for a curriculum. There are others who are stuck in their ways who are like, we're doing the best we can, which I agree. Educators are doing the best that they can. And on policymakers, I think that policymakers have a lot on their plate and they don't have the opportunity to authentically engage on the ground. So although they feel like they are in the space, they are never really in the space because electeds should be able to look at a district and know, some very pertinent details. So when I go in spaces and I share out this information, after we get through all of our feelings, after everything processes, it's like, what do we do? So the parents, especially, our parents are, we are not sitting back and letting anything hold us back. So what does that mean? We're not going to wait for policy to get in place. We're going to start making moves now because it's personal. We don't have the privilege. We don't have the opportunity. Our kids are getting pushed along. We have to ensure that they have the proper future. So we are working within solutions around high impact tutoring, whether that is something that's taking place within the city. So shout out to Buffalo, who is the bright and shining star that I love to talk about when it comes to high impact tutoring. They have created a village with higher education, with their city of Buffalo, with all of their local district schools, and they are really serving the children K through 12 within Buffalo public school systems. The other piece is what I didn't mention around the social economic and economic challenges within our report. So New York is one in five children are living in deep poverty. And that isn't talked about clearly. It's not going to be highlighted, but our comptroller did do a report. So we have families now advocating on behalf of expanding our state's Empowered Child Tax Credit that's going to support students, not only just how they show up in school, but how they can have a whole full circle life outside of school. And then what we've seen as far as legislative wins last year, we know the dyslexic dysgraphia community has been doing this fight for years and years. They're OGs in this work around early literacy, but they were able to utilize a lot of data that was utilized for the early literacy science and reading movement. And they actually got legislation passed last session to have a dyslexic task force. And now this task force has now put out recommendations, and now we're going to have some impactful policies in place in the coming future for students who have dyslexia or who need intervention. So these are all examples of how parents have really just put themselves in a place of power, whether it was locally, statewide, and then, MPU is always doing it on a federal level.
So it's just so wonderful to watch parents harness this data, make it actionable, and call for change, not just sitting with it, wondering what it is, literally creating their own report so that they can hold the systems accountable and demand real solutions, and solutions that we know are evidence supported to make real change for kids. This is the power of giving parents that information and not being so paralyzed with fear that, oh my gosh, if we tell parents bad news, they're just going to yell at us. Well, we might fuss a little bit, but we also might make a report that creates the political space to get some really powerful things done and have a real conversation. And that's what's been beautiful to see. Well, now it's our turn to turn over to Maryland and Tiara Thomas, who is a member of the Piscataway Kainai tribe and also serves in the Maryland Commission on Indian Affairs. She's an extraordinary parent leader, and we are so blessed to have her as part of the Leadership Council on Assessment and Accountability for the National Parents Union. So Tiara, welcome, and would love to get your perspectives in this conversation. And, I guess we got to start off with the obvious. Obviously, Indigenous students and Indigenous communities, face some really unique challenges in education. So I guess we start off first and foremost with sharing your perspective on the NAEP results and how they in particular have hit in terms of, reaction from your community.
Thank you so much. And Asharia, thank you for sharing about New York. We see some of those challenges in Maryland because we have such a delay in our data here. We're testing students all the time, but it takes us 4, 5, 6 months to get the data results. And then for our Indigenous communities, when those results come out, we don't have that included in the data. I actually just worked on an executive summary that's going to go to the governor of Maryland about making sure that we're included in data, right? And that's across all departments, because we're seeing that throughout our state agencies, we're not included in data, and there's no different when it comes to education. So for me specifically, I also chair the Parent Indian Advisory Committee in Charles County, which is the district that I live in. And we are the only district that still has an Indian education program in Maryland. And the reason is because school districts were saying, I can't justify paying for a coordinator when I don't really know what they're doing other than some cultural classes. And so when we started having the conversations in Baltimore County and Baltimore City and Montgomery County around data, there was no data to point to. Even how our students were registered in school and identifying that students were available to have services, we didn't have the data. I'm going to pick on New York a little bit right now, Asharia, and say that if you look at New York, they have identified 1% of their student population as Native students, but in the NAEP results, there are no results for those students. So when it comes to looking at things like the formula grant through the Office of Indian Education, which allows, under Title VI, it allows for us to create programming that meets the unique cultural needs, language needs, and educational needs of American Indian and Alaska Native students, and ensure that all students are meeting challenging state academic standards. How do we put that data in the grant if we don't have the data? So New York in 2022, you guys actually created your Indigenous Education Commissioners Advisory Council, but we still don't have data. So how can we say, boom, we have this council, we've stood up a council because we recognize that we have 8 communities here that need this service, but we don't have the data to say what services they need. Maryland, same thing. We're losing funding in Maryland. We're losing federal funding in Maryland because we don't have the data to support our students actually needing this. In my district alone, we asked district leadership for student data around reading. This was from a parent whose kid was in 2nd grade, and they're like, hey, I have some concerns. And we've identified that, you know, there may be some language barriers because they were not from a Maryland Indigenous tribe. They were moving to the area from out of state. And we were not able to provide that data for Indigenous students. My district is right outside of Washington, D.C. We have many students who are coming from other states here because of work or military and things like that. And so it's not just about Maryland Indigenous students, it's about Indigenous students who are in our systems, period. And so as we continue to recognize that there are challenges, especially for students that may be off res or on res, we don't have the data to support it. So when we're asking for federal funding to support it in our school systems, it really is impactful.
So let's go back to where we started in this conversation, and also in the chat when we started talking about Maryland, the data lag, where we're talking about, you know, first off, when it comes to our Indigenous children, we don't even have data. But holistically in Maryland, we're having a problem with data lag. Can you talk to us about how frustrating that is for you as parents on the ground, trying to get information about what's happening in the system and how that's caused problems?
Absolutely. So I have my daughter, Tamia. She is in the 11th grade. I just found out this year when some of the other students in her algebra trig class had to take MCAPs over, that she didn't have to take it because she had passed it. And I'm like, well, when are y'all going to send home that data? And they're like, oh, she should bring something else to do this day because she doesn't need to be tested again. So that's how much of a lag. And she took it in 10th grade. We're in 3rd quarter of 11th grade. So it really is a big lag. And I'm like, okay, so then I get a letter home and it tells me what the data, what she scored. And yeah, she didn't have to retest and she did proficient. And I'm like, okay, that's great. But I would have loved to know that going into the 11th grade, or even when I was in 10th grade, making her schedule for 11th grade. So as we're looking at what advanced classes are we putting our kids in, are we asking for the right support? If we're getting it a year after we're building the schedule out from the previous year, it doesn't really help, because now I'm already a year and a half behind. And so when we're talking about advocating and going to the district and asking for additional supports, we're also a year and a half behind. And then our budget cycle and the data cycles, they also don't match up. So to me, that's been the biggest frustration, is by the time we're addressing the things that we need to address, there's already a new issue to address.
Well, what's so interesting is that in all of the polling that we have from the National Parents Union, when we ask parents directly, you know, do you support statewide assessment? Do you support federal assessment of education? We're right now seeing probably the highest levels of support for state and federal assessment that we've ever seen from parents. And I would argue that that's probably as the result of a pandemic, and all of us in the parent community have awoken our inner high information seeking mode, because we're worried and concerned that our kids are not okay, and whether or not we've actually addressed a lot of the learning loss that we've seen. But it's very interesting to see, you know, how that lag can again create this level of frustration and distrust, and frankly, you know, agitate and cause greater division between parents and families, as well as the, you know, our educators in the system itself. So Pascal, I also want to invite you to jump in on the Maryland issue as well. You are not only our Deputy Director of Impact for the National Parents Union, but you're also a Maryland parent also in Charles County. So want to pose the question to you as well. Obviously, you know, you're seeing on the national level the NAEP data, you're seeing, you know, information come out about Maryland, but also at the same time struggling to get the information that you need so that it can be actionable enough for you to organize to do the big things that need to be done in Maryland, which is one of those states in the messy middle that, you know, is kind of teetering on which way we're going to go. So join this conversation, and what's your perspective?
Tira is my ride or die, and she knows, she and I speak data every day. And so when you get parents that are advocating for their child, they're also advocating for their communities or families and everyone within the state. When I tell you the lag is so incredible, and it doesn't just affect me with my conversations on what I can get my 3 kids, Camila, Kyrie, and Kamari, it also affects how I can advocate for my district at the state level. So we also asked for data around community schools because we're facing budget cuts and deficits. And so we're trying to make sure that we are being fiscally responsible, and education is going to be cut. And what was being proposed with community schools being cut, we asked for data around wraparound services so we can help our district so that we don't see budget cuts to our schools that have these wraparound services for our families. And we couldn't get that data. So it's so frustrating because it not only affects my individual advocacy for my kids, it affects the advocacy I can do for my community, for my state, and for every child in my great state of Maryland. It is extremely frustrating, and it causes me so much concern, especially when we hear these national conversations around giving everything back to the state. When I can't even get things from my state today, I can't get data, I can't get national data, I can't get interventions. So what am I going to be doing here without data from the national level? What am I going to be doing when my state doesn't collect data that's so valuable for me to help advocate for children across my state or across the country? And then when I heard Ashara say, educators are doing the best they got, they're doing the best they can with what they got, right? And if we don't have data, I can't advocate for you to get more. And so you're going to want to give all these 25 students or 26 or 30 in your classroom interventions or extended learning opportunities, but I don't have the data for me to be able to help you advocate for that. So we're going to go around in this cycle where no one's going to get caught up unless we have data that is reliable, timely, and actionable, so I can help get those interventions and resources. Byron had said it in the chat too. Like, Maryland is, we are capable of doing this work, and yet here we are still in 2025 where I can't even figure out data for my community schools, which get the funding to do all this work and interventions and wraparound services, for me to advocate for it to continue being a community school.
Amen to Erin, who's in the chat right now. Data belongs to the people. Data belongs to the students, the families, and communities. Amen, sister. Well, now we'd like to travel out west. This has been a great conversation with these powerful moms, but we have extraordinary dads, the fathers of the movement as well. So John Johnson, who is joining us from Colorado, he's going to flip his camera on and join our conversation because John is a parent and a man of the people. He is right down there with us and sitting around that lunch table with the youth, having these conversations, understanding, what is really important to them and fighting for them every single day. So John, so grateful to have you join this conversation. And you're also on mute, just reminding you there. But want to get your perspective in terms of whether or not you believe that sometimes schools and frankly the state are afraid to actually share this information from us. It's almost as if they're afraid of the reaction that they're going to receive. Why is it important for schools to make sure that they're having open and transparent conversations with parents and families from your perspective in Colorado?
It's important first and foremost for change. I mean, if we don't know what we're chasing, there's no way that we can, address it first and foremost. And I think from what I see from Colorado standards, looking at the assessments and what our numbers are, we're around 46% on the fourth grade, and I think 34 or something on the other one. I don't have that in front of me. I do have the data to support, but uh, like you spoke, transparency, understanding. I think the advocating that I go on, I just wish that we had more open opportunities to be in the schools, to be able to see the data, the delay. We also have a delay in when our numbers are registered. It seems like I don't know on what the time frame is. I'm not as embedded as most of you folks are within the school district, but from what I have seen in my observation, what the issue is within our school district is that they don't. I think our kids, kids of Afro-American descent or kids of color. What I am seeing, I think the expectation is just to meet the benchmark and not supersede that benchmark. And I think that's a point of satisfaction, just kind of wading a water type mentality. As long as you're there and you're not sinking, we're not concerned. And what I have seen based upon this data and doing some research of my own within the Colorado school district is these numbers are reflective of middle class to upper class school districts that kind of hold the weight for say to this data that's been published, and I don't see that these numbers are reflective of our lower to middle class school district. And I think what it is they, we're getting high marks in the upper to higher class communities, but we're not meeting even benchmark in less fortunate school districts.
Now, you spend a lot of time with other parents, with the kids, literally like at the very grassroots level. What is the conversation like with parents when NAEP comes out? What does it feel like? Do you think they're aware? Do you think that schools do enough to make sure that the parents that the parents you organize and talk to every single day are aware of what's happening?
I don't. And the reason, and I can speak a true testament to the school district we're currently in. I'm trying to organize PASS, and that's Parents for Standards, more or less for kids of color. And that's just a group to even offer to what you kind of spoke for the transparency. So they know what's going on within the school, where their kids are testing at, what's going on, what's been done to address kids that are not meeting the benchmarks, and there isn't. But I think a lot of that we have to be overly advocating. I mean, fortunately, I am a little bit more embedded within the schools. Unfortunately, a lot of the parents don't have that same likelihood. But yes, there is a concern, and they kind of mirror what I was what I'm speaking of, is that they just feel like they're not being informed. Our informed times is parent teacher conferences, and we're talking that's 3 times a year or twice a year even. And I don't think that that's even close to being adequate to offer the right data for the students or where their kids at. And I think that's where we see the decline. As we spoke, 4th grade, I think K through 2nd or K through 3rd, it's kind of hard to really give them the proper data because there isn't tests that are being performed. And I think that's where the numbers will come to 4th grade. I think now the data has been produced, but what's been lost happened through kindergarten to 3rd grade, where they kind of coddle what's being taught and not really putting emphasis or hearing. I hear, oh, they're doing fine, we're not concerned. But that doesn't really spell out what the issue is or if there is an issue. And that's why we see the data come up, in the 4th grade. But this happened well before the 4th grade even happened.
Those are great reflections, John. We appreciate hearing from you. Pascal, I want to bring you back into the conversation and kind of talk about the work of the Leadership Council on Assessment and Accountability. I think we can all agree, from what we've heard on the grassroots level in these different states, these different experiences, whether, folks are organizing on the state level, where they're doing more organizing in their county, or at the hyper grassroots level, it's clear that parents are hungry for this information. Or any information. This frankly is just the information that we're given. This is all we've got. And I do want to, first off, talk a little bit about this beautiful project where we've brought, these parents together in partnership with Unidos and the National Urban League to really inform a perspective around where we are now and where we could go. Because again, this is just the data that we've been given. You get what you get and you don't get upset, right? Well, we're upset and we want some more and we want something a little bit different. And, we're not entirely sure that this is the full picture of what we need to see from the system when we want to really have a good picture about what's happening and where our kids are. So Pascal, kind of walk us through the project a little bit more in depth and in terms of, what some of the findings were around this year-long project we embarked on.
Yep. So spoiler, we're going to put it in the chat and parents are upset. And parents are upset because we are not capturing everything. Like spoiler, executive summary, we're upset. Because there's so many things that we're missing. We're missing the conversation, like the data that we're talking about when we're at the dinner table conversations around like, is my child a critical thinker? Does my child have empathy? Does my child understand complex concepts? Like, can my child think beyond the things that, you know, they're given right now? And so our parents want more data. They want timely data. And so what we did with the Leaders Council is that we asked them to dream big. First, we were actually looking at the current systems that we have, and we reflected on that. And we said, okay, well, what is missing then? What do we want to see? And something that John talked about and everyone's talking about is also the communication piece of it. How do we want this data given to families? How do we want to be part of the discussions and the co-designing of things like your strategic plans, which every district should have a strategic plan and every school should have one. If you don't, please go talk to your principal and your district superintendent immediately and tell them we sent you. So how are we co-designing those plans? But some things that parents were saying around communication engagement, they want regular, clear updates on student progress. They want to be introduced to homework policies, visibility on student understanding, not just, oh, bring me everything on Friday that your kid's done, but like, I want to know if my kid is mastering concepts. I want to make sure they're understanding it. They want proactive communication channels between parents and teachers. Not to where you're just getting that one mandated parent-teacher conference a year. Like, forget that. That should just be the bare minimum. We want more conversations with data where you're aligning it to your interventions. Tell me if my child is not on grade level that you're about to do X, Y, and Z intervention. Pull-out groups, extended learning opportunities, tutoring programs, peer-to-peer tutoring, whatever it is that your district offers, or the best practice, which is also listed here in our reports. Do that, but pair it up with the data so it makes sense for me. What our parents are also saying is financial barriers and resource gap. Right now, we're in a scary time where every state is having to do these budget cuts. We are also going to be seeing the budget cuts coming from our federal government as we see the dismantling of the Department of Education, which we all hate and is really scary. And so now that we're facing these financial barriers, tell me though, how you're expanding school provided tutoring or academic support programs, pair that with the data like we said. Tell me what equitable access to resources, particularly what John was saying in our historically resilient yet underserved communities looks like. Like, tell me what that is. Because for me as a parent of 3 to have to go find it is I need a whole PhD. And in your data systems, which our parents have said before are crazy and insane, now you're sending me to 3 different platforms, whether it's from higher education, whether it's from your Department of Labor, whether it's from NAEP, whether it's your state dashboard that you loved and you said you brought in parent collaboration with, but it was only 3 parents in the room and you're like, and they loved it. And it doesn't make sense to anybody. Like, that needs to be revised, like transform that. And our parents are saying, we want that access to the data, but it needs to make sense. And we want to also make sure that it's being paired up with holistic successes to metrics. So both academic and non-academic, like we were talking about. I remember one clear quote from our parent leaders that said, I am reflecting on the things that my kids brings to the dinner table. If they're telling me about the drama that happened in 3rd grade or the things that happened at 7th grade lunch, like there's like peaceful negotiations that are happening in throughout the day. How's my kid getting measured on that? How do I know that they're becoming a full, healthy, rounded adult? How are we looking at the whole child, as well as the very important foundational academic things my kid needs to learn how to do? And then how are you also tailoring that to your curriculum, to ensuring that you actually are teaching high quality math, which most states don't even know if they are. Like, that's the other spoiler. How do you know that you're actually teaching high quality science and it's reading and it's aligned to the science of reading? Most states have just started doing that in the last 3 years, with some states still not having anything in place for science of reading or for their teachers to actually get trained on this. And something Charlie had mentioned also is things being done with fidelity. It's all great and good when you have it written out and you're like, this is what we do. But when it's not done with fidelity, what happens then? And are you reflecting again back with the data on telling us that you are actually doing these things with fidelity and all across your districts, your schools, your classrooms, it's being implemented? Another
So-
great idea from our parents is building workshops around data literacy. Like, teach us the power of data and the language of data, so that we can co-design things with you. We don't want to be recipients of you gave me something 3 months after the fact. It's not helpful. I want to know, as we're having budget conversations and as we're working on your strategic plans in your districts and your schools, which everyone should have.
Yeah, it would be helpful to actually have that data as soon as we could get it, maybe even as soon as, I don't know, the districts get it, because it's interesting and puzzling. In many of the conversations that I've listened to, we can't understand as parents why in the year of Beyonce 2025, when we're all taking these assessments on computers, why we can't have that information as quickly as everybody else gets it. So
Exactly.
I want to open this up to some of our other parents on the panel as well, in terms of the experience and some of the other things that they discovered. Tiara, I want to open it up to you and ask you, was it helpful to hear from parents in other states, other, different, backgrounds coming together in this national group to see how much common ground that, all parents everywhere are really actually concerned about data and frankly making sure we get the answers to our questions? Was that comforting, or was it upsetting to know that this is a problem everywhere?
Both. So I think that it was comforting in that, it's the parent power and the advocacy of us coming together and saying we want to address this collectively and being that unified voice. But it's also kind of scary that so many of our students are facing the same problems, and so many of our districts are not being transparent. We're not doing things with fidelity, and that our kids are the ones that are suffering. And so, for me, I teach in higher ed. And so I see this real time, of what happens when we don't address these things in K through 12 and they get to higher ed. So I think that for me, I love the conversations that we have had about what else do we want to see measured from our students, and having those conversations about, soft skills, and having those conversations about navigating world peace in middle school, because they're real, right? And especially if you have a teenage girl, they're real. And I feel like that, for me, it was another way for me to look at what am I asking my district for? What am I asking my state for? And how am I utilizing the access that I have to make sure that we are holding those accountable who need to be held accountable? I don't take it for granted that because I am somebody that just doesn't go away, I don't take no for an answer, that I have access that other parents don't. And so, Pascal talked about it. We talk about data every day. Every time I get a new report of something, I'm calling her. I'm like, hey, have you seen this? Let's take a look at this. But, one of the things I looked at was, how many clicks does it take for the Maryland State Department of Education before I can get to our standardized testing? How many clicks is it going to take? From a marketing background, if it's taking you 5 clicks, you've already lost me. I don't care anymore. I'm distracted, especially if there's something else that caught my eye along the way. And I think that some of those things are done intentionally. And so when I'm looking at the same platforms happening in other states, it really is enlightening that we have to do better as a nation on making sure that we have access to this data. And we're so closely linked to DC and Virginia here that I'm also always in their data and minding their business because because as they grow up, these kids are going to be working in global markets and they're going to be working with each other. So I always want to know, what's my neighbor doing? I'm a little nosy like that.
Well, and I'll say also, we're looking at things because I saw that as one of the questions. When we were talking, the Leaders Council, when they were talking about assessment, they were talking beyond standardized assessments. And I know everyone goes there and they're important to talk about, but we were also talking about things like iReady, illustrative math, things like IEP evaluations. We were talking about all the kind of assessments and evaluations your child may possibly experience in their K through 12 education, because there are so many. But how do you bring that all together for those data discussions, like Tiara was saying, to make sure it's making sense? How do you tell me what's possible too, so I know the person I need to go to ask for the big ask? But our parents, I love that you brought that up here around like privilege and access to information and access to know who I need to go to. But I want every parent to know here on like who's tuning in, you can do that. You can be that parent. Like be the Tiara in your state and in your district that won't go away, that's asking the hard questions, that's asking for the data. And if you don't get it, tell them to sit you down and break it down for you. or actually, no, call the National Parents Union and we'll break it down for you, because we'll break it down to where you know this is what this means, but this is what you can ask for, and this is what your state is doing, and this is what's actually in their budget allocations this year and in their policy. And if they don't have the policy, call Ashara, and Ashara will white you some policy that you can pass in your state. That's what parents are doing with data today.
And that's the power of the network. Ashara, I want to bring you into this conversation for the final moments here as we move to some questions. So if you have questions right now, we're going to encourage you to make sure you write into the Q&A box so we can answer those questions for you. But Ashara, you know, I'm loving this conversation about, you know, it's great. The NAEP data, like we're getting a report about, you know, reading, about math, we're kind of getting what we get. We're having this robust conversation about assessing schools, you know, on the state level as well, in terms of, you know, here are the metrics that we're willing to give you. And parents actually have some real ideas around what more we also need to assess schools about. And we're seeing some of this in the chat, but also I've seen it in our focus groups, in our councils, in our polling, in conversations I've had across the nation about this. You know, things coming up like assessing schools on, you know, how well they, you know, adhere to IEP plans, and getting some assessment from parents and getting feedback directly from parents around, you know, their allegiance to making sure that they're adhering to the special ed process, and seeing some real numbers side by side with this academic information. Also around parent engagement, which unfortunately we do not have a universal definition of. So without that, we are not meaningfully measuring. And unfortunately, that is leading to a lot of folks to say that they engage in parent engagement, which we're all told is critically important to getting our kids to better outcomes for kids, but we don't measure it. So we are not really assessing it. And so parents don't really know whether or not these systems are doing a good job, because if you can't measure it, doesn't really matter. And we can tell that with how much money is actually allocated to these things that we're always talking about being critically important. So from your perspective, what else are we missing? What else are parents looking for when it comes to, I don't know, additional things that we should be adding on when we talk about assessment and accountability?
I mean, so one, I think we've hit it on the head with a number of things. Timely. So it's got to come on time. And that is the key piece of any data that's going to be actionable. And that's a requirement for any piece that we talk about within education. You know, I can only speak from the New York lens. We took the data, again, the singular digit data that we had within math, and we repurposed it into forming our state's first math statewide coalition. So across New York, you know, across the country, everyone is clearly focused on early literacy and the science of reading, but very few states are really doing work around math and intervention and analyzing high curriculum instructional materials. So we actually convened on that topic, and we've been doing it for 2 years now. And as Pascal mentioned, we actually have drafted legislation based off of identifying key states who are leading in that work within numeracy. So we've taken time out to do our homework. We've done our due diligence, just in case anyone tries to check us. We already got the receipts. And now we are moving forward with legislation. We are in the process of really having conversation on what New York is missing and what a lot of policymakers don't know that we're missing. So, and that all came from the data itself. And, you know, I think that when I talk to families around utilizing data, I think it's important as advocates, we all come with that human perspective. We all come with our personal stories, but I think it's like double down, powerful, you know, it's cookies and milk kind of vibe, where like you need the qualitative, you need the inner story, but you also need that data point. So with anything that parents do, hammer it home with the data, but be true to your story, be true to your lived experience.
Great. Thank you so much, Ashara. And we want to thank all of our panelists. We're going to move to our Q&A portion of the program today. So we do have some questions. If you have a question right now, maybe you've put it in the chat, move it to the Q&A so we can make sure we get to everybody's question, and as many as we possibly can. And again, appreciate your comments as we move through here in the chat as well. But one here, we're going to start with Pascal. Do parents understand the difference between basic and proficiency? Doesn't basic mean that a student/state is performing at grade level? Of course, we want students to always do better, but if basic is grade level, that seems important to communicate.
Yes. So yes, our parents do. Like, we break it down on what it means between like basic and proficiency. And what we want is to make sure that every child reaches their fullest potential, whatever that may mean. And you want to pair that up again with the interventions and the supports in your district or in your state that you're able to provide. Everyone should be breaking that down for families. And that's what our Leadership Council was also explaining within our recommendations. Create some workshops in your district and in your school, in your community, to start speaking the language of data. Because if we're all speaking the same language, it's easier for us to co-design things, and it's easier for us to advocate together. So start hosting those workshops with your parents, breaking not just that down, but also hearing from them so that you're not making them conform to what is an antiquated system on assessments and accountability. Start co-designing what assessment data you want to collect together as a community. Like, your data should be a reflection of your data, and your budget should be a reflection of your priorities as a community. Like, that's what we always say. So if your budgets aren't reflecting the priorities of your community, if you're not including parents, which are one of your biggest stakeholders in that conversation, you already failed. If your strategic plans, which should be done again annually and together in your schools and in your district, talk to your state superintendent and your superintendents and your principals. But if those are not being co-designed with parents, you're missing a large part of the vision of what your community is saying they want for themselves. So again, you're failing, but start doing those workshops. That's part of the recommendations.
Another question in the chat. We'll start with Ashara for this one. We are a data collecting district. However, we are very hesitant in sharing the data with parents or caregivers, citing some privacy issues, particularly in small schools. Any suggestions here about how data is shared at the local school level while maintaining privacy? Whew, that's quite a question.
Yeah, so I'm not really sure around the privacy guidelines, but first and foremost, you have to tell your stakeholders. You have to be forthcoming and honest. Parents and caregivers can be your biggest advocates or possibly your biggest enemies in a situation if you're disclosing important data and information. So I don't know in regards to the privacy factor, but again, hosting open forums, open conversations, with a variety of times. So not inconvenient times, do some Saturdays, do some evening calls, do some morning sessions for some grandparents, but really trying to gain access to as many as of your families as possible. And then again, double down, sending out digitally. If you can pop up on some houses, if you have a small community in your district, hey girl, I'll bring Aubrey on. Meeting with parents. You can't just, it's not a one and done situation when you are sharing out data. And if it's important to you, you're going to do your due diligence to connect with as many families as possible and translate it and be available to not only answer questions, but be available for uncomfortable conversations.
Tara, I want to turn to you as well, because I could see your eyebrows going up a little bit for this. And I have to be honest, from the parent perspective, the idea that we would be kept from information that's critically important is upsetting, that's even a question. I know that a lot of the it kind of goes to the fear factor that I think a lot of folks have about parents and families, and the fact that, a lot of folks just aren't taught what I refer to as bedside manner. Often, in the medical setting, like if a doctor's got to give you some bad news, they got to give you some bad news. Together you can come up with a treatment plan, but you got to tell me, that I'm in trouble. You got to give me the diagnosis. But often in education, like it's a question as to whether or not we want to confront what's right in front of us, or whether or not that should actually be shared with us as critical stakeholders and decision makers are around, what's going to happen next. And we need good information in order to make those decisions. So Tiara, what's your reflection?
My reflection on that is, if anybody is familiar with Charles County, Maryland, we are rural, we are small. We have, everybody knows everybody and is related to somebody. So I think that for me, one of the things that we have to look at is how are we delivering the information? Because I think that there is a way to have those conversations, but we also have to realize that we can utilize personal conversations if we need to have personal conversations. And what happens a lot of times that I see is that they don't want to have those personal conversations because we can't answer very pointed questions. And so if I can put it in just a broad statement, I don't have to answer personal questions of how are you going to help my child? Because the school conversations, the district conversations, the state conversations, they're great. But a lot of times parents walk away from those conversations saying, okay, well, how does this help my child? Because as much as we care about everybody else's kids, we also care about ours. And so if I can't see a direct connection between this data and my child and what this data is going to do, as far as how are you rolling out your budget? How are you deciding which intervention programs are you going to have? For me, when I'm looking at Title VI and I have parents coming to me saying, well, you guys say that you're supposed to provide specified academic supports for Alaska Native and American Indian students, but I don't want to have a conversation because there's only 20 parents in the room and somebody might figure out who I'm talking about. But I think that that's a cop-out. It's a cop-out because within our community, we're always the smallest number. I'm always going to be the smallest community. So if I took that answer all the time, I'd never have information to do anything. So I think that it is important for us to continue to push to make them uncomfortable, because I'm uncomfortable with the way our NAEP scores look. So you're going to be uncomfortable with getting me this information.
Quote that, please.
There's another t-shirt for you. As you can see popping up, there is a poll, a quiz that the Campaign for Grade Level Reading needs you to fill out. So I hope that all of you will be doing that diligently to make sure that that is included as well. Our final question, I want to throw to whoever wants to volunteer here. Schools must see parents as partners. What would be strategic steps to allow for there to be a bridge that connects schools to parents? I don't know, John, Ashara, Tiara, Pascal, what would be your best piece of advice? Maybe we'll do this rapid fire here. Pascal, we're going to start with you.
I can't help myself. There's no easy bridge or Cybertruck that's going to take you to community. Go to the community. Like you just got to be in community. There's no other easy way to do it. Please don't do it just by overserving your community or sending an email or doing the talking points or doing whatever the app you use. Like those are great ways and great tools, and I love that for us. But to physically go into your community and talk to a parent one-on-one, where you're building meaningful relationships and you're bringing them on in valuable, mutually respectful ways, there's no other tool is going to do what that can do for you. Doing that is going to build the strongest foundation you have to bridge the school to community connection. And again, bringing them on, not just as a recipient of information, not as a recipient of your plans, not as a recipient of education, but saying you are part of your child's education journey. You are part of co-designing what we're trying to do here. What your priorities, aspirations, hopes, dreams, and fears, those should be representative in your plans, in your education, in your schools. And if you're not seeing that, then you're not in community. So I'm going to need you to go to community, literally walk there, go knock on a door. And if you don't know how to do it, that's okay to say that too. Bring people on like the National Parents Union. We teach people how to do that, because there's no easy fix. Nothing else is going to do it. Go knock on a door.
Ishara?
Yeah, I second that. There's literally no strategy. Like you got to be a real person. You have to take time to not only you can share out what you're looking for, but you need to listen and you need to be invested in listening to parents. So it all comes from building organic relationships. This is hitting home for me right now because, you know, it's legislative session. A lot of folks are asking families to come out and lobby, and they can't get a turnout because you haven't engaged them. How are you going to call them up for one day when you haven't talked to them on, you know, a good day, a bad day, an introduction day of a bill? So with that being said, building organic, real relationships with families is key, but also not just trying to bring them along when you need help. You need to be there for them when they need help or when no one needs help. Let's talk about good days. It's all of that.
Tiara?
I'm going to piggyback off of that and say also, for me, recognizing that there's diversity in your communities and getting to know the diverse populations within your communities. We're not all the same just because we got the same zip code, okay? So you can't come to every family the same way, and you have to meet people where they are. Stop expecting them to show up and meet you. You have to go out and meet them.
John?
I agree. I agree. What I would add to that, I would say modeling the expectation and consistency amongst the parents that you engage. And I think that's what brings about them being involved and committed to it. So, you know, kind of model the expectation.
Well, I want to thank everyone for joining us in this conversation and being a part of this. I hope all of you enjoyed it as well. And we want to invite Sarah to come back to wrap it up for the campaign for grade level reading. But thank you so much for inviting us to share in this conversation and this perspective. And we hope it was helpful from the National Parents Union.
Thank you, Carrie, and thank you, panelists. You get me, not Sarah, but I just say for those of you who've been listening in and out, like there have been powerful moments, right? John says to us, like, parents may be concerned, but without information, how can they advocate? Because I'm going to use a bunch of your words because you all said it best. Pascal says doing the best they can isn't the same as doing the best with what they've got. So we need to be asking the question, what do parents want? They want data to be timely. They want regular, clear data around student mastery, interventions, learning opportunities. They want to know who the data is reflective of, right? Whether it's Native American students, lower middle class students, is it those with the biggest gaps or is it not? And that reminder of the data belongs to the people, the students, the families, the communities. And so we have a role, a responsibility as communities to make sure that parents are part of the process, that they're co-designers, not recipients. And so what we can do as communities is go in our community, talk to parents, bring them in, be in the listeners of what they have to say, get to know the populations in the communities, and then model the expectation, engage them consistently. And so we encourage you to take those steps, be part of that process, engage in that. So thank you for those of you who joined us for this session on decoding NAEP. If you missed the previous session, Sarah just dropped the link into your chat. And we do have one more session coming. And so we do want to encourage you to join that as well as everything else that we have coming up. And so on March 18th, next week, we will see you at 12 p.m. Eastern Time for Harnessing the Power of Communities to Help Children, a funder-to-funder conversation, or come back on the 18th later in the day for the perspectives of state chiefs. If you want to hear from them, if you have questions that you would like to ask your state chiefs, you may get those answers next week. And then on the 25th, we have a couple of sessions coming up. One where we can hear from leaders in Georgia about their support around summer learning. And we also have a session in the afternoon or later in the day on
children as collateral damage in this current state. So for those of you who are looking to connect with the Campaign for Grade Level Reading or with National Parents Union, we will share links to all of the resources that we've discussed today, as well as how to connect with NPU in our follow-up email. And so we encourage you to keep your eye out for that later in this week. And I want to say one more time, thank you to our panelists for sharing your expertise, your thoughts, your ideas throughout this session today. So thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
Thank you.